In the quiet college town of Moscow, Idaho, a horrific crime shattered the community's sense of peace. In the early morning hours of November 13, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students, Kaylee Goncalves, Chapin, Xana Kernodle, and Madison Mogen, were brutally murdered in their off-campus home on King Road. The discovery, hours later, came from a chilling 911 call about an unconscious person made by one of the surviving roommates. This call would kickstart one of the most intense and perplexing homicide investigations in recent memory. When police arrived, the scene was baffling. There were no signs of forced entry. The 4 victims had been stabbed to death in their beds on the upper floors. Yet 2 other roommates sleeping on the first floor were completely unharmed. This contradiction left investigators and the public with a flood of questions. Who could commit such a heinous act and leave witnesses behind? The initial hours were filled with confusion and fear, as a killer was on the loose with seemingly no motive and no clear leads. The first major break came from an eyewitness account. One of the surviving roommates, identified in court documents as DM, told police she was awakened around 4 a.m. by what she thought was one of her roommates playing with her dog. Soon after, she heard crying. When she opened her bedroom door, she saw a figure in black clothing and a mask walk past her. She described him as athletic, about 5'10", with bushy eyebrows. Paralyzed by fear, she stood in a state of frozen shock as the man walked out the back sliding glass door. But the most critical piece of evidence lay right next to one of the victims. Investigators found a tan leather knife sheath with a U.S. Marine Corps insignia on it. On the button snap of that sheath, they discovered a single source of male DNA. This tiny biological trace would become the linchpin of the entire case. While investigators worked to identify the source of this DNA, they also asked the public for help, focusing on a specific vehicle, a white Hyundai Elantra, seen on surveillance footage near the King Road home multiple times, both before and after the estimated time of the murders. The search for the white Elantra and the mystery DNA profile led investigators across the state line just 10 miles away to Washington State University. There, they zeroed in on a PhD student in criminal justice named Bryan Kohberger. He drove a white Hyundai Elantra that matched the description. The puzzle pieces were beginning to fall into place. Investigators delved into his digital footprint and made another startling discovery. Kohberger's cell phone data showed his device had been in the vicinity of the King Road home at least 12 times in the months leading up to the murders. This wasn't a random act. The killer had seemingly been scoping out the location for weeks, if not months. The investigation reached a critical turning point in late December 2022. As Kohberger traveled cross-country to his family's home in Pennsylvania for the holidays, law enforcement was watching him. Under the cover of darkness, federal agents quietly sifted through the Kohberger family's trash. They recovered several items, including a used Q-tip, and sent it for immediate DNA analysis. This was the moment of truth. The DNA profile from that Q-tip was compared to the unknown male DNA found on the knife sheath from the crime scene. It was a match. Investigators now had their man linked directly to the crime scene by his own DNA. The irony was staggering. Bryan Kohberger, a student meticulously studying the minds of criminals and the methods of law enforcement, had allegedly committed the ultimate crime. He likely knew all about DNA evidence, crime scene contamination, and investigative procedures. Yet in what investigators believe was a moment of haste or arrogance, he left behind the one piece of evidence that would irrefutably tie him to the murders, his own genetic signature on the weapon's sheath. This fatal mistake would seal his fate. On December 30, 2022, a heavily armed SWAT team descended on the Kohberger family home in the pre-dawn hours. Bryan Kohberger was arrested without incident and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. The nation watched as the unassuming criminology student was extradited back to Idaho to face justice. The arrest brought a sense of relief to the terrified community of Moscow, but it also opened a new chapter filled with legal battles and the agonizing wait for answers. For nearly 2 years, the case moved slowly through the legal system. Prosecutors announced their intention to seek the death penalty, setting the stage for a high-stakes trial. Kohberger maintained his innocence. and his defense team prepared to challenge the DNA evidence and the cell phone data that formed the core of the prosecution's case. The public was bracing for a lengthy and emotionally draining trial that would force the victims' families to relive their worst nightmare in a courtroom. Then, in a stunning turn of events on July 2, 2025, just as the trial was about to begin, Bryan Kohberger changed his plea. In a deal with prosecutors to avoid the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to all charges. The man who had proclaimed his innocence for years finally admitted his guilt. 3 weeks later, the judge handed down his sentence, 4 consecutive life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for the burglary charge. As part of his plea agreement, Kohberger waived all rights to future appeals, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Justice had been served, but one haunting question remained. Why? Why did Bryan Kohberger target this house and these 4 specific students? By all accounts, he was a total stranger to them. There was no known connection, no prior relationship, no clear motive that could explain such a brutal and personal attack. With his guilty plea, Kohberger avoided a trial where more evidence might have been revealed. He took the answer to that central mystery with him to his prison cell, leaving the families and the world to forever wonder what drove a promising criminology student to become a ruthless killer. The case is closed, but the story feels incomplete, a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying question is the one that can never be answered. Thank you for watching, and if you found this breakdown informative, please consider liking and subscribing for more deep dives into compelling cases.